So, okay, that introduces perfectly the sort of geopolitics of it all. And the story that you just told is one of extraordinarily, extraordinary fragility on several manufacturers in East Asia, which is far away from the biggest economy in the world, the United States, the biggest emerging economy, the continent of Africa. How can we explain this fragility? Taiwan is not even its own sovereign country, and South Korea has enemies to its north and to its west, and I suppose Japan could be an ally of sorts, but that's two very precariously placed locations for what is, you could make a very strong argument for, the most important component to modernity.
I think you're right. And if we were redoing history, I think we would not accept a situation where we had so much concentration of risk in this part of the world. I think it's inevitable we get concentration because the industry requires such capital intensivity. There's been a trend towards monopolization or creating oligopolies in certain types of parts of the supply chain. We see it in lithography. There's one company that makes EV tools, and there won't be another one. But that's not the only part of the industry. There's numerous parts of the supply chain where there are one or maybe a handful of firms that basically control their sliver of the supply chain. And I think this trend towards concentration in the chip industry is, to a certain extent, inevitable. But why did this end up being concentrated so much in Asia? Well, to understand that, you got to look back to the earliest days of the chip industry. So when Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore founded Fairchild Semiconductor, which is kind of thought of as the first startup in Silicon Valley. They founded it in the late 1950s. They were immediately faced with the problem of how do you get enough workers to assemble chips. So once you've fabricated a chip, you need to have someone stick the wires on it that then go from the chip to the rest of the device, for example. And that was always a laborious process. And so they hired workers from California, but they quickly discovered that they could pay people 1/10 of those wages in Hong Kong. And so from its earliest days, early 1960s, Fairchild had opened a offshoring facility in Hong Kong. And from that point onwards, every chip company in the United States had offshored production facilities. And when you started having chip firms in Europe and Japan grow after that, they too started offshoring to East Asia. And the cheapest labor in the most organized fashion was Hong Kong, Singapore, Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, which is why you've got this focus on East Asian supply chains today.
Talk to me a little bit more about the geopolitics, and forgive me if I'm belaboring the point, beleaguering, not sure what the word is, but if Taiwan was without TSMC, how much would the US really care about Taiwan?
Well, I think if you look at the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, what you'll find is that the U.S. cared the most about Taiwan and was willing to spend the most defending Taiwan in the 1950s, when Taiwan was the least important to everyone. And in the 1950s, we almost went to nuclear war with China over Taiwan during the first and second Taiwan Straits crisis.
No idea.
Yeah, in the late 50s. And at that time, Taiwan was an impoverished island that was totally irrelevant to the
Yeah, they just had the Chinese nationalists come in and sort of run it over, right? Yeah.
That's right. So I think the question of would the U.S. care about Taiwan still, and the answer is yes. But I think there's a different question that I'd ask, which is what would happen if things go wrong in the Taiwan Straits and you get some sort of military escalation between China and Taiwan, or maybe something that brings in the wider region. And there I think that in addition to being a disastrous war, which it could well be, and I worry about, you'd also have profoundly tumultuous effects on the rest of the global economy, because Taiwan produces around a third of the new computing power we rely on every year. And if that were to disappear, it would take over a decade to rebuild. And in the interim, we would have a third less ones and zeros on which to run every piece of software we want to run. So smartphones, computers, the telecom infrastructure, autos, airplanes, dishwashers. It'd be hard to buy almost anything the first year after. And I worry a lot that we're not prepared for that.
Talk to me about what you think is the likelihood or possibility of genuine conflict that will disrupt the global supply chain more than it already has. I'm not saying all-out war, but in the realm of possibilities.
Well, I think it's frighteningly possible. If it's easy to assume that because the situation in Taiwan has been relatively stable over the past 2 decades, that it will stay stable. But it was as recent as the 1990s that the Chinese shot missiles over Taiwan, and the U.S. sailed an aircraft carrier through the Taiwan Straits to force the Chinese to stand down. And it was only a couple decades ago that the Chinese were still regularly shelling islands that the Taiwanese control in the Taiwan Straits. So I think we should be concerned. I look at Eastern Europe today and say, many people told me that we were done with warfare in Eastern Europe, and now I guess I look at the risk that we're about to enter a new one, and I think the same thing could well be true in Taiwan. And it doesn't have to even be the result of a deliberate escalation. It could be that one side decides to escalate, but it could also be that there's an accident happening. Two planes collide in the sky, or two ships at sea, and no one wants to admit they were at fault or back down. Any of those scenarios, I think, could lead to something really dangerous in political terms, but also in economic terms.
And so does that explain the last 12 months, the sort of geopolitical flare-up and attention to chips, the identification of just how fragile the global supply chain is because the majority of the chips comes from this disputed island in the South China Sea?
I think it's partly that. There's another part of it as well, which is that the U.S. and a lot of other countries, but I think the U.S. has been particularly focused on this, is coming to realize that the next generation of economically crucial technologies and also militarily crucial technologies will depend on computing power. And so making sure that you've got an advantage in your ability to produce computing power is going to be important, not simply so you can have the best metaverse, but so you can have the best military too.
Wow.
And so the U.S. has historically tried to keep a couple generations ahead of China in semiconductor technology. And that was easy to do in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. That's getting harder to do now, which is why you've seen the U.S. try to impose more restrictions on the transfer of technology to China to make sure the U.S. has the technology it needs to keep its military edge.
That paints significant incentive for China to occupy Taiwan.
Well, the trick for China is that although it would love to own Taiwan, the prospect of conquering Taiwan would be difficult to do with the semiconductor facilities intact. Because if you start thinking about explosions occurring around an EUV machine, it wouldn't take much to knock some of the ultra precise instruments out. So I struggle to imagine a scenario where you have fighting and TSMC's fabs remain intact. And it would only take one or two disgruntled engineers in Taiwan to sabotage the entire situation if in fact the Chinese took over. So I don't worry as much about the Chinese saying we're going to invade to take over the fabs. I worry more about the Chinese saying we're going to invade anyway because we want to control Taiwan, and in the process knocking out not only Taiwan but also this kind of crucial node for the global economy.
There's almost like there's another sort of idea of mutually assured destruction. If the engineer does decide to just sabotage things, so I wonder, could you view TSMC as some sort of military advantage? If so, it's like can be considered a weapon. If so, it's like a heroic act to say, well, I'm not going to let China get their hands on this, nor the US. I don't know.
Yeah, well, and it's clear that the US wouldn't put it this way, but the US is trying to sort of weaponize, if you will, TSMC more now than ever in the past. It's been trying to cut off a number of Chinese firms from being able to produce chips at TSMC on the grounds that certain Chinese firms have produced chips for TSMC and then put them into Chinese military equipment. And in the past, the U.S. kind of turned a blind eye to that type of thing. Now they're being much more tough and saying, we demand that TSMC produce chips for U.S. military equipment, but we don't want that to happen with Chinese military gear.
To return to something you just said before, if say TSMC was disrupted or ruined completely, it might stifle the progress. It would just be this unbelievably disruptive event on the global supply chain. which really highlights another point, which is that how important computing power is to the ongoing innovation of modernity and our technologies, and just how much we really, really, really rely on it. Could you just emphasize that point for us?
Yeah, I think if you start to think about the number of devices you have that don't have semiconductors, it's there's very few devices that you rely on a daily basis that don't have semiconductors, and that's only going to increase because as communications get better, as it becomes possible to send more data through the airspace with 5G telecom technologies, the incentive to use more computing power in more types of devices will only increase. And so we talk about the Internet of Things, phrases like that, but that's really just beginning right now. And I think if you look forward in a decade, you're going to see more and more devices that are plugged into each other in terms of their ability to transfer data to one another, which means that they're going to have multiple types of chips in them, some to process the data, some to remember the data, some to transmit the data. And as we get more and more computing power in the same amount of space, thanks to Moore's law, it'll be possible to make even simple devices smarter. Because right now, intelligence is complicated and it's expensive, but in 2 years, we're going to have twice the processing power thanks to Moore's law. And 2 years after that, twice the same amount again. And so we're going to have smarter and smarter devices across the scope of devices we're looking at. So I think we've only begun to think about what will autos look like in 10 years, for example. Today we think of autos as something that will drive us around town. But if you look at the semiconductor content going into new cars, and especially the more advanced new cars like Teslas, the number of transistors in a Tesla is extraordinary. And I think we're only beginning to understand what those will be used for going forward.
Take us into the future then. 4 years, we've doubled computing power twice. How do you see chips affecting technology around us in a very tangible example?
Tangible example. I mean, in some ways, we're so used to this process happening, we take it for granted. We take it for granted that everything will be better in a couple of years' time. Our connections will be better. Our phones will have higher resolution cameras on them. The entire thing. I think the key thing that we're just beginning to roll out is the ability to have artificial intelligence present not just in vast data centers for things that companies make priority projects, but rather for all types of devices. So we're going to have devices that are more focused on looking at what we do, learning from it, and operating accordingly. And when we think of artificial intelligence, I think most of us think about algorithms. And then after algorithms, you think about data. But in fact, what makes artificial intelligence possible to roll out at scale is computing power. Because the reality is we've got tons of data, more data than we know what to do with. And algorithms are something one can write, but the real limiting factor is, can you get enough processing power on your device to run whatever artificial intelligence application you want to run? And we're right now getting to the point where the answer to the question is increasingly yes, that we've got the processing power, so we can not only make our most advanced data centers smart and have them churn through lots of data, but we can also make our dishwashers smart and our cars smart and our cell phones smarter than they are, because we're going to have the transistor budget, so to speak, the number of ones and zeros you need to actually do that.
That's it. The last one was exactly the one that I was thinking about. Smart iPhone. The amount of interaction you have with that technology on a day-to-day basis, if it didn't just rely on algorithms and say your Gmail, your Google account learning from its behavior and interaction, but the entire interaction with the phone and it improving over time, which is entirely possible. It's simply a matter of computing power. We have the technology to actually do that. Kind of, the software is going to be able to develop in lockstep with the increase in computing power. We can't imagine. That's actually kind of the exciting part of it. So much of the applications exist in the unknown. It's the fourth order consequence that was totally unpredictable, which ends up being the future of humanity. So that's fascinating, incredibly exciting. I was just struck, Chris, while you were answering that question, how much of an authority you are in this subject. You haven't stuttered once, no ums, no thinking. It's all top of head. This is really amazing. So thank you for that. I want to draw your attention towards a company called Planet. You just mentioned the unknown potential of data. This is maybe me just projecting too much what my interests are at the minute, but this company, Planet, are you familiar with them? Yeah, okay. So for the audience, biggest satellite company in the world. They have the most in orbit. They're imaging the planet daily, which basically means you're going to have a historical data set of how the image of the surface of the Earth is changing over time. It's amazing the type of applications we can do with that. And this is such a tangible example that is enabled by the processing power. And 10 years ago, no one thought that, well, people might have seen that as a potential, but it wasn't possible. I see Planet as an archetypal example of what power processing can enable, and for the betterment of humanity and the future as well. Because obviously there's the weaponized component of it, but there's also just amazing liberties that technology is going to afford us.
I think that's right, and when you are able to marry the data, the new data, whether it's image data, word data, whatever data it is, with the processing power, that's where you get the real extraordinary advances.